final months of 1945, the world was still recovering from the destruction of war when a small team of explorers set out to map a chain of mountains in an isolated region. Their mission was simple: to survey caves and chart unexplored areas that had remained hidden from human eyes for centuries. What they did not expect was to stumble upon something that would baffle not just them, but generations of scholars and researchers who would later hear of it. Inside one of the deepest caverns, beyond narrow tunnels and treacherous passages, they found a vast underground chamber. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a massive natural cave. But as their lanterns illuminated the darkness, their jaws dropped. The walls were not bare stone, but meticulously carved shelves, rising higher than the light of their torches could reach. And those shelves were filled with books, scrolls, and manuscripts unlike any they had ever seen. The explorers, exhausted from their journey, could hardly believe their eyes. They expected bats, strange rock formations, or perhaps evidence of an old mining site, but not an entire library hidden in the heart of a mountain. Each shelf seemed impossibly straight, cut with precision that defied the crude tools of the ancient world. Some books appeared bound in thick leather, but not the kind they knew. This material shimmered faintly under the glow of their lamps, almost as though it was alive. Other texts were rolled in scrolls, sealed with strange metallic clasps that carried markings they could not recognize. The room felt untouched by time, as though no human had set foot inside it for centuries, perhaps millennia, yet the air was dry. And the manuscripts seemed perfectly preserved. The first reaction of the explorers was disbelief. How could something like this exist without anyone knowing about it? There were no records of any civilization ever living in that mountain range. Local villages had never spoken of such a place. And yet here it was, a fully formed repository of knowledge, larger and more complete than many of the greatest libraries of history. Some whispered among themselves that it was impossible, that what they were seeing must be an illusion caused by fatigue and the flickering light. But when they touched the shelves and felt the weight of the volumes, the reality was undeniable. As they began to examine the surroundings more closely, their sense of unease deepened. The stone walls bore no signs of chiseling or tool marks. It was as if the rock had been shaped by something far more advanced than hammers and picks. Smooth curves ran along the edges of the shelves, and intricate carvings decorated the border symbols that no one in the group recognized. The patterns resembled writing, but not in any script that had ever been recorded in human history. Stranger still, when their eyes lingered on the symbols, some of them swore they saw the shapes shift ever so slightly, as though the markings were alive, rearranging themselves in ways the mind could not fully process. The group debated whether they should take one of the books back with them. Curiosity clashed with caution. What if they damaged something irreplaceable? What if the library was not meant to be disturbed? The atmosphere of the chamber was heavy, thick with an unspoken tension, as though the very air carried a warning. One explorer, braver than the rest, pulled a book from the shelf. It was heavier than expected, and its cover felt unnervingly warm to the touch, as though it held some energy within. When he opened it, the pages shimmered faintly, revealing symbols that shifted under his gaze. He could not read a word of it, yet he felt as if the book itself was watching him. Hours passed as they moved cautiously through the chamber, documenting as much as they could in their notebooks. They sketched the layout of the shelves, copied some of the strange symbols, and tried to describe the impossible craftsmanship of the place. But even their best efforts seemed inadequate. How could ink on paper capture the scale of a library that stretched into the darkness, a place that seemed both impossibly old and unnervingly alive? The deeper they explored, the more they realized that the library seemed endless. Corridors branched off in multiple directions, each lined with more shelves, more volumes, more knowledge than they could ever hope to study. It was as if the mountain itself had been hollowed out and transformed into a cathedral of books. At times, faint sounds echoed through the passages, like whispers just beyond hearing. The explorers froze whenever this happened, uncertain if it was the wind, playing tricks, or something else entirely. By the time they left the cave, They were not the same men who had entered. Their sketches and notes could not capture the sense of overwhelming mystery they had experienced. They had uncovered something that should not have existed, something that defied history, archaeology, and logic itself. And yet, no matter how unreal it seemed, the weight of the books in their hands and the images burned into their minds left them with no doubt. They had found a library that was never meant to be found, a library that had remained hidden for reasons they could not yet begin to understand. When word of the discovery began to spread among a select circle of scholars and officials, the hidden library immediately became the subject of both fascination and fear. The explorers who stumbled upon it had brought back only a handful of items: one shimmering bound book, a series of sketches, and notes describing the cavernous chambers. These items were carefully examined in secrecy, away from public eyes, for fear that the revelation might spark rumors too wild to control. It was during these first studies that the greatest mystery of all emerged: the language of the texts. It's unlike anything ever recorded. The symbols covering the pages, the scrolls, and the carved inscriptions on the stone walls did not belong to any known linguistic family. They were not Egyptian hieroglyphs, not Sumerian cuneiform, not any form of ancient script preserved in history. It was a language that seemed to resist every attempt at understanding, as if it was designed to remain hidden from human comprehension. Teams of linguists, cryptographers, and historians were assembled to make sense of the writings. Each expert approached the texts with different tools. Some looked for recurring patterns, hoping to find a key similar to the Rosetta Stone. Others studied the structure of the symbols, attempting to classify them as alphabetic, syllabic, or logographic. But no matter how long they worked, the language eluded them. The symbols seemed to shift in meaning depending on the observer. Different researchers reported seeing subtle variations in the same text. One scholar swore that certain characters looked like constellations, while another insisted they resembled mathematical formulas. The texts appeared alive, mutable, adapting themselves to defy translation. Some speculated that the library contained knowledge from a civilization so ancient it had been forgotten entirely, a culture that predates Sumer and the Indus Valley. If this were true, it would mean that human history was far older and more complex than anyone had imagined. But others, more cautious, wondered if the library might not be of human origin at all. How else could one explain the strange, shimmering materials of the books, the flawless construction of the shelves, and the shifting, unclassifiable script? The possibility was whispered in closed rooms. Perhaps this was not a library of men, but of something else entirely. As the researchers pressed on, they noticed unsettling patterns. The books, when left open, sometimes emitted faint sounds, a low hum, a murmur at the edge of hearing. The symbols on the page seemed to pulse faintly, as though responding to the presence of the reader. Several scholars reported sleepless nights after spending hours with the texts, plagued by vivid dreams filled with landscapes they had never seen and voices speaking in the unknown language. A few even claimed to understand fragments of meaning, though they could never explain how. It was as though the books were not meant to be read in the traditional sense, but absorbed directly into the mind. This strange effect soon became a source of conflict among the researchers. Some argued that the language was a form of knowledge beyond human comprehension, a kind of higher code that could not be reduced to alphabets or grammar. They believed that the library contained truths that could only be understood through direct experience, not translation. Others warned that such thinking was dangerous, that exposing one's mind to texts of unknown origin might have consequences far greater than anyone could predict. Yet despite these warnings, the allure of the language was irresistible. Scholars found themselves returning again and again to the same passages, drawn to them like moths to a flame, even though they claimed to gain no clear understanding. Over time, peculiar incidents began to mount. One researcher who had spent weeks studying the texts without rest suddenly vanished, leaving behind his notebooks filled with strange scribbles that matched none of the known symbols, but seemed to mimic their shapes. Another fell ill, complaining of whispers that never ceased, even in silence. Some of the guards assigned to watch over the collection refused to enter the chamber after nightfall, claiming that they heard pages turning when no one was inside. The language, it seemed, was not just incomprehensible, it was alive, an active force interacting with those who dared to approach it. The inability to translate the texts began to frustrate the authorities overseeing the project. They demanded progress, answers, explanations that could justify the enormous resources being poured into the study. But the more the researchers tried, the less sense the language made. It became clear that the library was not a gift to be easily unraveled, but a riddle designed to protect its secrets. The explorers who had first discovered the chamber had spoken of unease, of a heaviness in the air that seemed to warn against disturbing the place. Now the scholars felt that same weight, as if the texts themselves resisted intrusion. The question loomed larger with every passing day. Who or what had written these books? Were they the records of a forgotten human civilization, erased from memory by the march of time? Or were they messages left by beings from beyond the human world, an archive that mortals were never meant to touch? Whatever the answer, the fact remained undeniable. The library contained knowledge no one could read, and yet its presence already began to shape the minds of those who tried. The symbols refused translation, as though guarding truths too dangerous, too powerful, or too alien to be revealed. The mystery of the untranslatable language drew not only linguists and cryptographers, but also philosophers, mathematicians, and even theologians. From the moment news of the library began to seep into certain academic and political circles, it was treated less like a discovery and more like a test, a puzzle, left behind by an unknown intelligence. Those who entered the chamber where the books were kept described a kind of overwhelming presence, as though the walls themselves carried intention. The scholars brought in to study the text felt that they were no longer merely researchers, but participants in something much larger, caught in a dialogue with forces they could not name. The initial excitement was palpable. To unlock the secrets of the library meant potentially rewriting human history, covering knowledge that had been hidden since before recorded time. The scholars worked day and night, poring over the strange volumes, sketching the symbols, cross-referencing patterns, and even attempting to replicate the shimmering ink with which the texts had been written. But almost immediately, disagreements broke out. Some argued that the texts were meant to be studied as mathematics rather than language, pointing to recurring sequences of symbols that resembled prime numbers and ratios found in nature. Others insisted the writings were more akin to a kind of music or rhythm, a code that could only be heard, not read, suggesting that chanting the symbols aloud in sequence might unlock meaning. Still others leaned into a mystical interpretation, claiming the texts were not words but incantations, knowledge designed to alter reality itself. It was during this period that the first signs of obsession began to show. Scholars who had once been calm and meticulous started behaving erratically. One professor from Germany was said to have spent 3 days straight locked in the chamber without food or water, staring at a single open book until his eyes bled. When his colleagues finally forced the door open, he had scribbled the same, a sequence of symbols hundreds of times across the floor, muttering that he almost had it, almost heard the voice clearly. Another, a brilliant mathematician from India, began to claim that the texts had revealed to him equations that described not just physical reality, but time itself. He warned that if the equations were solved completely, the barrier between present and future would collapse. His colleagues dismissed this as madness, till he suddenly disappeared without a trace, leaving only a journal filled with equations that no one could make sense of. The psychological toll grew worse the longer the project continued. Some researchers complained of headaches that worsened only when in the library chamber, as though the very air pressed against their skulls. Others reported hearing faint voices that whispered to them while they worked, urging them to focus on particular passages. A few even admitted to dreaming in the strange language, waking with phrases on their lips that dissolved into nothingness. Once spoken aloud, one historian, previously a skeptic, claimed she had finally understood a passage and tried to share her revelation with the team. But the words she spoke made no sense, a series of broken syllables that sounded harsh, An alien. The memory of that attempt shook the group to its core, for she insisted she was not the one choosing the words, it was the book speaking through her. As obsession spread, so too did division. Some of the scholars urged that the project be shut down, convinced the texts were never meant to be deciphered, that they were a kind of forbidden knowledge, deliberately concealed from humanity. Others argued the opposite, that turning away would be a betrayal of human curiosity, that perhaps the books contained answers to humanity's greatest questions: where we came from, why civilizations fall, what lies ahead. This rift deepened as strange phenomena multiplied. Pages seemed to change when no one was looking. Books left in one corner of the room were found in another. One guard swore he saw a figure, robed and faceless, moving silently among the shelves when the room was supposed to be empty. The more the scholars tried to push forward, the more the library seemed to resist. Their tools failed, computers jammed. When scanning the texts, recording devices produced static, and photographs developed with blurred or distorted symbols, as if the library itself chose what could and could not be preserved. And yet, for every warning sign, the pull grew stronger. Even those who feared it most could not stay away for long. The texts exerted a kind of gravity on the human mind, a lure that no rational explanation could justify. Time, it became clear that the scholars were not unlocking the library's secrets. The library was unlocking them. Their sanity, their will, their very sense of reality was being tested, bent, reshaped. What had begun as an academic exercise had become a personal struggle for each of them, a battle between curiosity and fear, reason and madness. It was no longer a matter of whether they could understand the books, but whether they could survive. The act of trying. The library was not just a repository of knowledge, it was an active participant, choosing who among them might glimpse fragments of truth and who would be consumed by the attempt. As months turned into years, the library's very existence began to shape the lives of those who came near it. At first, the oddities could be brushed aside as coincidences or the result of exhaustion, a flicker of light where none should be, a sudden drop in temperature, shadows that lingered a moment too long against the cavern walls. But as the pattern of strange events grew, even the most skeptical among the researchers began to admit that something inexplicable surrounded the library. The air inside the chamber felt different, thicker, as if filled with an invisible weight pressing down on every breath. Clocks brought into the chamber often ran slower than those outside, their seconds dragging as though time itself was reluctant to pass within those walls. Instruments designed to measure humidity, pressure, or radiation gave erratic readings that shifted without reason, often registering impossible values that no one could explain. Witnesses claimed that the books themselves were not always the same. A scholar might open a volume one day to find a particular sequence of symbols, only to return the next and see the same page entirely altered. Yet when shown to others, the text appeared unchanged, leaving the reader questioning their own senses. A guard once reported hearing the sound of pages turning long after the chamber had been sealed for the night. Another swore he glimpsed a figure moving among the shelves, though no trace of intruders was ever found. Over time, the researchers grew accustomed to such reports, treating them not as isolated hallucinations, but as part of the library's atmosphere, a presence that could not be denied even if it could not be measured. The more unusual events did not stop there. Dreams began to plague the researchers with uncanny regularity. Almost all of them reported visions of vast cities that stretched endlessly beneath alien skies. Towers built from materials that glowed faintly in the dark, oceans that shimmered like liquid glass. Some dreamed of endless staircases, others of voices calling from beyond the horizon in the same incomprehensible language found in the books. When these scholars compared their experiences, they were disturbed to find eerie similarities, as though they were all tapping into the same collective vision. Certain dreams were even shared in exact detail by people who had never spoken to one another. The dreams left many shaken, their minds burdened by images that felt less like imagination and more like memories not their own. Were also the disappearances. One archivist assigned to catalog the books vanished during a routine inspection. His colleagues believed he must have wandered off, but search parties combed every corner of the cavern with no result. Days later, his notebook was found resting on a shelf inside the library, open to a page filled with the same unknown symbols. Another incident involved a translator who had been working obsessively on a single manuscript. One night, his screams echoed from the chamber, and when his team rushed in, they found him collapsed on the floor, eyes wide open, muttering in a language no one could understand. Though he lived, he never spoke coherently again, and he spent the rest of his life sketching strange diagrams that seemed to map places no one could identify. As if the library itself was aware of those who studied it, certain individuals seemed to attract more disturbances than others. Young archaeologists reported feeling watched every time she approached the shelves, and once claimed she saw her own reflection in the polished cover of a book, but it moved independently, its lips shaping words she could not hear. Another researcher, exhausted after weeks of study, insisted the shelves shifted while he wasn't looking, rearranging themselves as though the library were alive. His claim was dismissed as stress until a visiting technician confirmed that the measurements of the chamber had changed subtly, with the shelves appearing closer together than in earlier surveys. The culmination of these events reached a point where secrecy could no longer contain the fear. Rumors spread of curses, of knowledge too dangerous to uncover, of scholars driven mad by whispers from beyond human comprehension. Those who still believed in the pursuit of answers argued that the disturbances were not supernatural, but a side effect of knowledge so advanced that the human mind simply struggled to contain it. Others whispered darker possibilities, that the library was a trap, bait left behind to ensnare the curious and consume them one by one. The government officials overseeing the project grew restless as the list of incidents mounted. Equipment failures, unexplained illnesses, breakdowns of sanity, vanishing personnel, these became impossible to ignore. And yet, for all the warnings, the library still pulled at them with irresistible gravity. The book seemed to promise something beyond imagination, secrets of civilizations lost to time, glimpses of possible futures, or perhaps the very mechanism of reality itself. But every attempt to grasp those promises came at a cost, a toll extracted not in coin but in fragments of the human mind. The scholars who stayed on could not agree whether the events surrounding the library were warnings or invitations. Was the shifting language a barrier designed to keep them out, or was it a test meant only for those bold enough to persist? Were the shared dreams an intrusion, or a gift of visions from another world? A consensus could be reached, but all who remained agreed on one truth. The library was not a passive discovery. It was active, responsive, and perhaps even aware. Its mysteries unfolded not in neat, linear fashion, but in unsettling, unpredictable ways that made those who entered its halls feel less like explorers of knowledge and more like subjects of an experiment they could neither control nor escape. In the years following the discovery, the story of the hidden library began to take on a life of its own. It's whispered in secret halls and passed between scholars like a forbidden tale. But the most haunting chapter came when the library itself seemed to vanish. The cavern where it had first been uncovered was documented, mapped, and carefully guarded. Teams rotated daily to ensure that no unauthorized person could enter. For a time, the strangeness of the place was almost treated as manageable, a phenomenon that could be observed, studied, and contained. Yet one morning, after a night of routine guard duty, the team arrived to find the cavern empty. The shelves, the books, the strange inscriptions etched into the stone all gone. In their place remained nothing but bare rock, as though the chamber had never been anything more than a hollow cave. Panic spread through the ranks of the researchers and officials. Equipment set up inside the chamber showed no signs of struggle or removal, no damage, no evidence of transport. It was as if the entire library had dissolved into thin air. Some of the officials accused the researchers of staging a deception, of hiding the books for their own gain, but the confusion etched across their faces proved genuine. Those who had risked their minds studying the texts were devastated, as though they had lost something more intimate than knowledge itself. For them, the absence of the library was not only physical but personal, like waking to find that part of their own memory had been erased. Yet the disappearance did not end the mystery, it only deepened it. reports began surfacing from far off. Places of individuals who described experiences eerily similar to what the scholars had faced. A traveler in South America spoke of stumbling upon a hidden chamber filled with glowing shelves, only to return days later and find nothing but jungle. A shepherd in the Middle East claimed he dreamt of a vast hall of books that spoke to him in whispers, guiding him to predict a coming drought with uncanny accuracy. A diver in the Pacific told of exploring an underwater ruin and glimpsing a library of glass volumes that dissolved when touched. These stories, fragmented and impossible to verify, suggested that the library was not bound to one location. It shifted, appearing and disappearing across time and geography, leaving behind fragments of its influence in the minds of those who encountered it. The scholars who had once studied it, secret, were divided over what this disappearance meant. Some argued that the library was never truly of this world to begin with, that its presence in the cavern had been only a temporary overlap of dimensions. In their view, the library might still exist, but in a space humanity was not meant to inhabit, slipping in and out of reach, like a shadow that could never be grasped. Others believed it had been deliberately withdrawn, as though some intelligence had grown weary of human attempts to pry into its secrets. They pointed to the incidents of obsession, madness, disappearance among their peers as evidence that the library was not merely a collection of knowledge but a living entity. Those who dared to approach, the records left behind by the scholars became artifacts in their own right. Pages of sketches, notebooks filled with scrambled attempts at translation, photographs of shifting symbols that defied consistency, all were archived under the highest secrecy. But even these remnants seemed unstable. Ink faded faster than it should have. Photographs blurred, and notes once legible became unreadable over time. It was as if the very memory of the library resisted preservation, slipping away just as the shelves themselves had. The more researchers tried to preserve evidence, the faster it decayed, until only fragments remained, fueling conspiracy and myth rather than clarity. For the wider world, the library was a rumor, a legend whispered among those drawn to tales of the unexplained. But for those who had entered it, who had seen the shimmering texts with their own eyes, its reality could never be denied. They lived with scars invisible to outsiders' whispers in their dreams, sudden visions of alien landscapes, flashes of symbols behind their closed eyelids. Some withdrew from public life entirely, unable to explain what they had witnessed without sounding insane. Others became obsessed with chasing the library's reappearance, traveling to remote corners of the earth in search of echoes of its presence, often disappearing themselves in the process. The great questions it left behind have never been answered. Who built the library? Was it the work of an ancient human civilization, erased from history yet more advanced than we dare to believe? Was it created by beings beyond our understanding who recorded not only the past but the future? Or was it something stranger still, a mirror of human thought itself, a construct that revealed what the mind feared and desired most? These questions remain suspended, tantalizing yet unreachable, like the shelves of books that once stretched into infinity and then dissolved into nothingness. The disappearance of the library ensured that it could never be dismissed as a simple archaeological find. It was no artifact to be cataloged and filed away, no ruin to be explained by dates and tools. Instead, it became a wound in the timeline of human knowledge, a reminder that there are places where reason falters and understanding collapses. Those who encountered it could never forget that for one brief moment, it stood before an archive of impossible knowledge and then watched it vanish, leaving only silence and questions that still echo today.